The first sight I had that morning nearly made me drop my coffee. 3 full-size buses grinding to a halt at the end of my gravel driveway. Diesel fumes coughing into the air, doors hissing open like some cheap carnival had just rolled into town. And then out poured the crowd. Families lugging coolers, kids dragging floaties, retirees unfolding lawn chairs, as if my pasture had suddenly become their private park. Then the kicker. A giant banner. HOA Summer Extravaganza, thanks to our generous host. I didn't need 3 guesses to know whose fingerprints were all over this circus. Karen, self-appointed queen bee of the HOA across the highway, the same woman who'd spent a year trying to rope my land into her empire of dues and nonsense rules. She had the nerve to tell 3 busloads of strangers that my property was a public amenity. For the record, my land had never, ever been part of their HOA. But that hadn't stopped her. Letters about my unauthorized goats. Complaints that my barn was painted the wrong shade of red. Condescending threats because I wouldn't show up to her meetings or cut her a check for phantom fees. She even quoted some nonsense about community buffer zones. I ignored every word until she escalated to this stunt. What she didn't know was I'd already had enough. Weeks earlier, I'd reinforced my steel gate, rerouted the security cameras, and added a remote lock I controlled from my phone. So I let them unload. Tables unfolded, grills lit, bunting strung across the pasture like it was the 4th of July. And there was Karen front and center in a neon pink pantsuit, barking orders through a megaphone, declaring this a victory against selfishness. The crowd cheered, convinced I'd fold in front of 100 witnesses. But at 9 a.m. sharp, I tapped my phone. The gate slammed shut. The metallic clang echoed across the field. Suddenly, the bus drivers realized they weren't going anywhere, and Karen's face drained like a busted pipe. She grabbed her megaphone, screeching about public land and community rights, but the panic was spreading. One driver nervously admitted he'd been told this was a public event. I just sipped my coffee and said, "Better park those buses tight. Nobody's leaving until the sheriff sorts this out." Even my goats started bleating in the distance, like they knew the show was about to get biblical. You could feel the mood shift. Parents got restless, kids whined, and mutters rippled through the crowd as people started realizing they'd been conned. Karen stomped to the gate, voice trembling. "Open this right now, you're making a mistake." I told her straight, "You brought 3 busloads of trespassers onto my land. If anyone made a mistake, it's you." Behind her, angry voices rose. People glared at her, demanding answers. But Karen wasn't one to back down. She escalates. Always. Luckily, I planned for that too. Cameras rolling, sensors armed, a few tricks waiting if things went sideways. By then, the sun was up, kids were crying, and Karen was darting around on her phone, begging county officials and HOA board members to save her. Her neon pantsuit, which had once screamed authority, now looked like a surrender flag. The county zoning officer, who I never expected to show, was leaning against a tree, arms crossed, already drafting his testimony in his head. Let me rewind a second. This land had been in my family for 3 generations. Never anyone else's business. When the subdivision cropped up, I tried to be civil. Karen didn't. Fake smiles turned into threats, then accusations, then lies. She even tried ticketing my truck parked beside my own barn. When I wouldn't budge, she made me the villain of her HOA meetings. That's why I built the gate. Not to keep neighbors out, but to draw a line. And Karen never respected lines unless she drew them herself. When the sheriff finally rolled up, blue lights cutting through the crowd, news vans on his tail, it felt like the curtain was rising on the final act. Karen lunged toward him, shrieking about being held hostage. He looked at her, then at the buses, then at me. "Ma'am," he asked flatly, "why are you on his property?" She sputtered about community rights, but when he asked for a deed, she had nothing. I handed over my title, survey, and tax records. He nodded. That was all he needed. The crowd snapped. People shouted at Karen, demanding refunds for the fees she'd charged. Reporters shoved microphones forward. The sheriff turned to me. "You want to press charges?" "Not today," I said. "I just want them gone." So the order came down, everyone back on the buses. Karen tried to rally them one last time, but nobody listened. Parents dragged kids away. Buses roared back to life, and the pasture slowly emptied. The most cinematic moment? Karen, alone at the gate, mascara streaking, clipboard trembling in her hands. She hissed, You've humiliated me. I just looked her dead in the eye. You did that yourself. I only locked the gate. Then the buses pulled away. The cameras shut off and silence returned. Justice with a side of exhaustion. But if you think that was the end, you don't know Karen. The very next morning, my phone rang. A lawyer on the line, civil action for unlawful detention, and a reporter asking for an exclusive. Round one was over. But the war? Far from finished. Even the zoning officer texted me that day. She's convening an emergency board meeting. Imagine that, Karen scrambling behind the scenes, grasping at straws, while my goats were sprawled out in the pasture, happily chewing weeds, utterly oblivious to the storm swirling around them. They didn't care about board meetings, lawsuits, or HOA bylaws. And that's the irony, because at its core, this whole thing was never about one party, one banner, or even 3 buses full of trespassers. It was about something bigger. It was about drawing a line in the sand for anyone who believes community rules outweigh the rights of private property. Karen didn't quit. She launched every weapon she could think of. Drones buzzing over my field. New stacks of paperwork showing up like clockwork. Zoning reviews, code inspections, anonymous complaints. Threatening letters in my mailbox, typed and unsigned. Local news segments painting her as some community hero, a martyr supposedly standing against my selfishness. She turned it into a war of attrition, paperwork, pressure, and public opinion. But here's the thing about a war like that. You don't win it with noise. You win it with patience, with evidence, with the truth. And every step she took only dug her hole deeper. When it finally came out that she'd siphoned HOA funds to pay for that ridiculous bus stunt, that was the turning point. Her own board ousted her as president. Suddenly, the army she thought she commanded evaporated. I got a letter in the mail, signed by dozens of those same guests who had once trespassed onto my land, apologizing, offering to testify on my behalf if it ever came to court. That changed the whole story. It wasn't me versus a mob anymore. It was just me versus Karen. But Karen, stripped of her title and her spotlight, didn't go quietly. She never does. She left nasty handwritten notes under my gate. She loitered at the end of my driveway in oversized sunglasses like a bad spy movie extra. Strange cars started parking by my fence at odd hours, trying to intimidate me. But by then, the world was done listening. Leaked emails exposed her real plan to sabotage my land and manufacture violations, and that got her slapped with a restraining order to keep her away for good. The final nail came when the county certified in writing that my land could never, under any condition, be claimed by the HOA. That piece of paper wasn't just legal protection. It was closure, like flipping the last page of a long, absurd novel. And here's what mattered most. After all the noise and spectacle, the buses and banners, the news cameras and internet memes, it was never about humiliating anyone, not even Karen. It was about holding the line, not just for me, but for anyone who's tired of being pushed around by power-hungry neighbors hiding behind clipboards and bylaws. When I was invited to speak at a nearby community meeting, I didn't go in to gloat. I went to listen. I stood up, told my story, and spoke my piece. The war didn't end with a dramatic standoff or a court trial. It ended with apologies, with neighbors shaking my hand, with a group of kids asking if they could feed my goats. And honestly, that's how it should end. Now, every evening, I sit on my porch as the sun sinks behind the pasture. The steel gate stands tall, catching the last light of day, and the goats wander free in the grass. The land is mine again. The line is clear. And the lesson? Simple. If you're going to defend something, whether it's your land, your family, or your principles, do it with patience. Do it with evidence. And never, ever let bluster rewrite your reality. Yeah, all of this really happened. Now I'll leave you with this. What would you have done if an entire HOA tried to take over your land? Drop a comment and let me know. Where do you stand on property rights, community rules, and the fine line between being a good neighbor and standing your ground? I'll be reading.